All righty. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We just have some quick housekeeping. If you want to go to the next slide, Mike, so we can show some folks. We just don't want to have any unnecessary noises or feedback that might be coming through. So if you have any questions during the presentation, that little bubble that says open chat panel, you can type your questions there and we will relay those to Dr. Ahmadi. So without further ado, let's get started, Mike.
Right.
You have your slide to your bios part?
I do. Did you want to do the introduction first?
Yep.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, hello, everybody. I'm just going to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Malek-Ahmadi. Dr. Malek-Ahmadi is a bioinformatics scientist at the Banner Alzheimer's Institute in Phoenix. Dr. Ahmadi earned a Bachelor of Science from the University of Arizona and a master's from the University of South Florida, as well as PhD from the University of Westminster. He has worked in the field of Alzheimer's disease research since 2003 and is an author of over 60 peer-reviewed journal articles in the areas of Alzheimer's disease, mild cognitive impairment, and normal aging. Dr. Ahmadi currently works at Banner Alzheimer's Institute, focusing on identifying and characterizing preclinical Alzheimer's disease using clinical, cognitive, neuroimaging, and neuropathological data. So without further ado, Mike.
All right, thank you, Chase. So a couple of things before I get started. I have tailored this talk to be, somewhat short in what I say to allow time for questions and discussion later on. And that being said, I do ask that we hold the questions until the end, and then we'll have plenty of time to have them asked and address them. As Chase just mentioned, you can put your questions into the chat function at the bottom, or if you are so inclined toward the end, I'm very happy to take questions live. So if you at the end want to turn your mic back on and converse with your question, I'm happy to do that as well. Also, I just want to say that I'm not a licensed physician. As you can see, I have a PhD, not an MD. So I am going to be limited in some of the questions I can answer. So if they're more medically related, I likely, I'll answer them to the best that I can. But certainly there are some that I cannot answer just because I'm not a licensed physician. So just want to get those things out of the way first. So really what I want to talk about today is really where we are with Alzheimer's disease research and where we're going. And hopefully by the end of this, we'll get an appreciation and, we can have some hope and, we can, feel good about where we're going and, how we're going to be treating Alzheimer's disease in the near future. So to start off with, just a little bit of where we are right now. And so right now, we estimate that about 5 million people in the US have Alzheimer's disease. And if nothing is done, if things stay at their current rate or trajectory of people being diagnosed with it, this is estimated to be 14 million by 2050. Currently, Alzheimer's disease is the 6th leading cause of death in our country. So right up there in the top 10, right there with heart disease, cancer, and others that we see as well. The next three are things that I like to point out because they don't get enough attention. I think that these are things that are much more impactful and to the families and particularly to the individuals who are affected by Alzheimer's disease. So those who are caregivers for patients of Alzheimer's disease provide about 18.6 billion hours of care each year and this would come out to about a value of about $244 billion. So if these individuals were to be paid, for the time they spend giving care, it would be somewhere in the ballpark of $250 billion. Now, our healthcare expenditures, particularly when I'm referring to this, I'm referring to Medicare more specifically, but our expenditures and how much money we spend just on Alzheimer's disease-related care in the U.S. is around $305 billion. And if nothing is done to, prevent Alzheimer's disease, and if we continue to see the same rate of new cases that we do each year, by 2050, the cost of caring for Alzheimer's disease in our country will be around 1.1 trillion. So you can see that there are some very practical and real, things that need to be addressed in order for us to not only, help the patients, but help, those who are caring for them and our society at large. So when we talk about, the risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, these are the main risk factors. Age is the number one risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. In particular, there's sort of a range, a 15-year range between 65 and 80, when we see most of the diagnoses occur. Now, this doesn't mean that people who are younger or older than these ages cannot be diagnosed. They certainly can be. We do see individuals in their early 60s, get the diagnosis, and then of course people who are well into their 80s and 90s, also can get diagnosed as well. But we see the majority of the diagnoses in this range of 65 to 80. Those who have a family history of Alzheimer's disease are at a higher risk, particularly those who have a mother or father who had it. There's also a genetic component to it. Certainly there's not one silver bullet gene that says you will or will not get Alzheimer's disease, but there are some that do increase your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Now, the last one is one that I like to talk about because it's what we call a modifiable risk factor. This is something you can actually do something about to prevent Alzheimer's disease. So one of the biggest questions we always get from people is, what can I do to prevent Alzheimer's disease? And my simple answer is don't get type 2 diabetes. So for the last 10 to 15 years, the medical research has consistently shown that people with type 2 diabetes are anywhere from 2.5 to 4 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. So the one thing that I can definitely offer as a tangible takeaway from this is that preventing type 2 diabetes is a very good start to preventing Alzheimer's disease. So recently, the World Health Organization published a set of guidelines and a list of modifiable and treatable risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. It's much more comprehensive than what I just showed here. But again, what it is in trying to impart here is that these are things that are under our control to a certain degree, and that we can actually manage and help to prevent the onset of Alzheimer's disease. So as far as what we're doing as a country from a national perspective, in January 2011, the National Alzheimer's Project Act was signed into law. And what this did was it provided a roadmap for Alzheimer's researchers and clinicians to really start to address Alzheimer's disease in a much more comprehensive and fundamental way. So there are 5 goals that this act established, and the first goal is the one that I will focus the most on, and that's prevent and effectively treat Alzheimer's disease by 2025. So as you can see, we're coming into 2022 now, and we're 3 years away from this target. It appears that we will be able to meet this goal, but certainly there may be some roadblocks as we've had over the last 20 years or so. But we are fairly confident that we're going to see sort of a new age in Alzheimer's disease treatment very soon. So when we talk about Alzheimer's disease itself, usually what we think of and what we're referring to, are a set of clinical symptoms of, memory loss, forgetting where things are, repeating statements, having more trouble with remembering the day of the week, the year, and things like that. But what I want to focus today on is really understanding the biology of Alzheimer's disease. So really what is, underneath and maybe, sort of the root cause of these clinical and cognitive symptoms that we are, so accustomed to seeing with Alzheimer's disease. So from a biological perspective, Alzheimer's disease is characterized by the presence of plaques and tangles that accumulate in the brain. Now, what's unclear is how these plaques and tangles actually start to form in the first place. There's a great deal of research that suggests that things such as inflammation, insulin resistance, and different cardiovascular factors may initiate the formation of these plaques and tangles, but there's definitely no certainty as to, what we know that, we don't know for sure what is actually causing, these plaques and tangles to get in the brain in the first place. So when we're talking about, when I mentioned plaques and tangles, so these are the actual pathological signs of Alzheimer's disease. So what these plaques are deposits of a protein called amyloid. And what they do is when they deposit in the brain, they are, basically sort of gumming up, the neurons that we have in our brain, and they're preventing the neurons from communicating with each other effectively. And also, because these deposits also prevent the neurons from getting their nutrients and things they need to, survive and function, this, ends up, leading to these neurons to be dysfunctional and to eventually die. I will say that amyloid itself is a very common protein. It's something that everybody has, going through your body. It's just that in Alzheimer's disease, instead of being cleared from the brain as it normally is, there's something, sort of amiss with that clearance mechanism that usually takes amyloid out. So it's getting stuck in the brain and then causing these amyloid plaques to form. Now, the tangles are a little bit different. So these are broken filaments of a protein called tau. And what happens with these tangles is they clump together within the neuron, and they actually themselves are part of the neuron and, start to, die itself. And I'll show you a figure that will help explain this a little bit better. So what you're looking at here is a tissue slide from a person who donated their brain to be examined. And what you're seeing here, and this tissue has been stained so that you can see clearly the plaques and the tangles that are in this piece of the brain tissue. So you see the plaques here are these sort of, round, orange parts, and the tangles are these very dark blobs with the, taking it here is the actual biology of what we consider Alzheimer's disease to be. Now, when I was, describing to you, the difference between the amyloid plaques and the tangles, on the left is, what is a characterization of what these amyloid plaques look like. So you can see that they are occurring outside of the neuron or the brain cell, but what you can see here is they're disrupting the branches from which these neurons communicate with each other. And here you can see in this, smaller slide is that, we don't have the amyloid plaques that are present, and the neurons, can communicate with each other as they need to. And then moving to the right, this is sort of how the tangles form. So when I mentioned that protein called tau, so tau, makes up, sort of the building block, of the neurons themselves. In particular, the part that stretches out and communicates with other neurons is made up of the tau protein. And so when this tau protein starts to break apart, as it does here, it then forms these clumps and, becomes what we call, the tangles. And again here, just another cartoon to sort of depict, what it is that we're referring to when we're talking about amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. So the plaques are occurring outside of the neuron, and the tangles are occurring inside of the neuron here. So the prevailing hypothesis and sort of the framework that we've been using for the last 20 to 25 years in our approach to researching Alzheimer's disease is something called the amyloid cascade hypothesis. And what this suggests is that the buildup of amyloid plaques, is sort of the beginning of the disease process. And then once an individual accumulates a high enough level of amyloid plaques, this starts to lead to dysfunction of the neurons, and eventually the neurons die, from having the amyloid plaques, sort of be on them. And then what we think happens is that once a certain level of amyloid plaques have been reached, that's when the neurofibrillary tangle deposits start to occur. And this eventually leads to, a very significant breakdown of brain tissue in very specific areas of the brain. Now, I want to caution everyone that this is definitely a hypothesis, is that, this is still something that is being refined, and, there's still a lot to be, fleshed out with this. So as I mentioned earlier, we still don't quite understand the mechanisms that actually cause the amyloid plaques to start in the first place. So that's something that is still being determined, but this is the general framework that researchers and particularly clinical trials for new treatments are going with and using to go forward with. So when we talk about the actual, plaques and tangles and, how they occur in the brain. So what I want to show here is sort of where they start and then how those plaques and tangles kind of spread throughout the brain as the disease progresses. So here on the top left, where you see the, sort of bluish areas, this is representing where we start to see the amyloid plaques being deposited. And in this section right here, so this is a part of the brain that is, very crucial for memory and attention and those kinds of cognitive processes. So usually, and typically what we see is that even in individuals who are clinically normal and were never diagnosed with any neurological disorder, be it Alzheimer's disease or anything else, many healthy people still have some degree of amyloid buildup in their brain. And it's very common to see people who are clinically normal to have sort of this level of Alzheimer's disease pathology in their brain. As we move to the right, we can see that the amyloid plaques are much more dense in this region now. And now we're starting to see them spread out to other areas of the brain. So we kind of consider this to be sort of a transitional phase in terms of the advancement of Alzheimer's disease at the biological level. So it's very common that we can still see people who are clinically normal with this degree of plaques and tangles that form, but now we also are starting to see people who are starting to have mild clinical symptoms in terms of some mild memory loss and things of that nature. And then as we go down here to this last part, this is where we see, very highly, advanced progression of the amyloid plaques and tangles that have occurred, not only in this, beginning area, but it is also spread much more densely throughout other parts of the brain. So what these amyloid plaques and fibrillary tangles eventually lead to, as I mentioned, is breakdown and death of the brain tissue. So what you're looking at here is a cross section of the brain. On the left is somebody who did not have Alzheimer's disease, and on the right is somebody who had severe Alzheimer's disease. And you can see very clearly, what exactly is happening. And you can see the brain is significantly smaller. There's lots of loss in several key areas here. So really, when we talk about Alzheimer's disease just at the biological level, this is unfortunately what the end result is, and why we see so many devastating cognitive symptoms as the disease progresses. I show these pictures here, and I apologize if any of you are squeamish, but these are actual brains from individuals who are enrolled in a autopsy program at the Banner Sun Health Research Institute in Sun City. And I put this up here to really highlight the work that's not just done at Banner, but throughout the entire Phoenix area and Arizona in general. Arizona has really put ourselves on the map in the Alzheimer's disease field, and we continue to be one of the leaders in the field of Alzheimer's disease research. And the Banner Sun Health Research Institute is definitely at the forefront of them. They have one of the longest running and oldest brain donation programs in the world. And we're very lucky to have this resource to us here. So Dr. Tom Beach, the neuropathologist who runs the program, supplied these pictures to me to really kind of show what a person who is clinically normal, what their brain looks like, and then compared to somebody who had Alzheimer's disease and what their brain looks like when we do the autopsy. And again, you can see the differences are very stark in terms of the loss of brain tissue that we see. So what we want to transition now to is looking at preclinical Alzheimer's disease and what exactly we mean by that. So I mentioned a little while ago that it's not uncommon for people who are clinically normal or cognitively unimpaired to have some degree of Alzheimer's disease pathology, when we do an autopsy on them. And what we've actually found over the years is that around 40% of cognitively unimpaired older adults have a significant degree of plaques and tangles in their brain when they come to autopsy. And what we think is that these individuals may represent preclinical Alzheimer's disease, where we see the pathological and biological changes, but their cognition and other clinical general clinical status is still normal. So this is important because we want to be able to identify the biological markers of Alzheimer's disease before the clinical symptoms occur. And this would eventually allow us to, treat the disease much earlier in the process. So what I really want to, emphasize here and really kind of get across to everyone is that we're starting to transition now in how we define Alzheimer's disease. We're transitioning away from a clinical definition to a biological definition. Now, the way that we do that is, we have sort of a starting point here. So this graph here is a theoretical graph. This is not based on any data or anything like that, but this is basically a way that we, how we're thinking about, so the preclinical stages of Alzheimer's disease. So in the far left, at the bottom here, you see, this cognitively normal text. And what we're referring to is that, individuals who are in this area here, who are not showing any memory or cognitive symptoms, but what we're seeing, and I'll just draw your attention to this red line and this blue line. So this red line represents the accumulation of amyloid plaques, and then the blue line represents the accumulation of the tangles. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of a lag time for these pathologies to develop before we start to see clinical symptoms occur. So in this clinical disease stage, starting here and then going on to the dementia stage, this is where unfortunately where most of our trials and most of our treatments, have been done. So as you can see here, once we're getting into this very early stage and into the dementia stage, the plaques and the tangles are basically at their peak by this point. And so this is really what has, prompted us to really kind of shift where we are starting to do treatment and to do them in this preclinical stage so that we can flatten these curves out and not have them, continue to increase. And the hope would be that, this would significantly delay or completely prevent the onset of clinical symptoms from occurring. Right. So the question now is, how do we actually, see the biology of Alzheimer's disease before the symptoms occur? So what I've shown you so far and have suggested so far is that, we can only see these plaques and tangles when we do an autopsy. And I will say that, doing a brain biopsy is not by any means standard, doesn't happen, and is not going to. So we have to, have a way to, see the plaques and tangles in the brain without actually having to take a piece of brain tissue from someone who's still alive. And we do that through brain imaging. In particular, we use PET scans. So a lot of you may be familiar with MRIs and maybe even had a PET scan done previously. But for several years now, we've had the technology available to us to actually see amyloid deposit in the brain of people who are still alive. And so we refer to these as amyloid PET scans. And what's been really great about these is that they've been able to be utilized for clinical trials, particularly for prevention trials. So how they're being utilized now is that when people are screened to be in a Alzheimer's prevention trial, they receive one of these PET scans, and they are deemed to be either amyloid positive or amyloid negative. So those who are amyloid positive, their scans indicate that there's a fairly high level of amyloid plaque pathology already present. And so these are the individuals who we are targeting for prevention trials because they are showing the biological signs of the disease, but not the clinical signs yet. And again, and just like with any disease, treating earlier often leads to much better outcomes. So this is a sort of a picture of what these amyloid scans actually look like. So on the far right is someone who is clinically normal, not diagnosed with anything, cognitively unimpaired, as we call it. And so this person is considered to be amyloid negative. So the parts here where you see the yellow, the red, and this green, this represents areas where we see the amyloid plaques that have been deposited. But so here, even though this person does have some degree of plaques that have formed, it's not to a level that we would consider them to be at a high risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. Now, to the far left, this is somebody who has clinical Alzheimer's disease, showing memory symptoms. And as you can see, there's much greater red areas and yellow areas where we see the amyloid plaques that have been deposited. And this is very consistent with what we typically see in an Alzheimer's disease person when we do these scans. Now, in the middle is really, the whole, it really kind of encapsulates what we mean by preclinical Alzheimer's disease, in that we have somebody who is clinically normal. So they are not showing any kinds of memory symptoms. They're performing well on different cognitive tests that they do. They're functioning perfectly fine in their daily life. Well, when we do this amyloid PET scan on them, they are at what we call amyloid positive, or they're showing a very high degree of amyloid plaque pathology already in their brain. So these are the individuals who we are ultimately wanting to identify very early on and then treat before the symptoms occur. So to give you an idea of just how this kind of translates into actual cognitive performance. So the graph I'm showing you here comes from a study that I did with my colleagues. And the basic point here is that when we look at a sample of individuals who were cognitively unimpaired when they passed away and had an autopsy done, and if we classify these individuals by whether they did not or did have amyloid plaques in their brain, that we see that those who had the amyloid plaques had significantly lower levels of cognitive performance compared to those who did not have the amyloid plaques. So this kind of is a hint to us that, maybe there is something to, even though this is a very subtle difference, there still may be something to, the presence of plaques as it relates to cognitive performance. And when we look at it over time, so when we take these same individuals and we go back, 5 or 6 years before they passed away, we see that, those on this red line, these are the people who had very low plaque pathology. And this blue line represents people who had very high plaque pathology. And again, these are all people who are cognitively unimpaired and clinically normal when they passed away. But we do see a pretty substantial drop-off in these individuals who had a lot of plaque pathology. So where we are now is that there are several Alzheimer's disease prevention trials that are ongoing here in the US and around the world. And they are enrolling individuals who aren't showing any cognitive symptoms, but are at risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, either by virtue of genetic status or that amyloid PET scan that I've been referring to earlier. Most of the studies now are exclusively using the amyloid PET scan to identify people who qualify for these prevention trials. And again, the overarching theme here is that initiating treatment before symptoms occur is likely going to provide the best clinical outcome. And again, our goal is to significantly delay and eventually prevent the onset of clinical symptoms altogether. So I know that anybody who follows the news, you're probably seeing a lot of news recently about a new treatment for Alzheimer's disease. And I'll go into that a little bit, but right now there are actually several different anti-amyloid therapies that are in various stages of clinical trials. And as well, there are also therapies that are targeting tangles, or what we call anti-tau therapies, again, in various stages of development. So I know that this new drug called Aduhelm has received a lot of press attention in the last few months. So to kind of give you a very short and brief overview of kind of how this came to be, was that in June of last year, the FDA granted approval for this drug called aducanumab, but the trade name for it is Aduhelm, which you'll actually see more of that in different press articles. So the FDA approved this drug, and they did so in a very unconventional and very different way than what we're used to seeing. So they did this through an accelerated approval process And basically, it's done because there is a very significant unmet need for a, disease that, is going to, have a very, huge impact. So they use this for, several different, therapies and different diseases, but they applied this to the Alzheimer's disease space in this case. So the approval was not based on a clinical benefit, whereas, for the last 20 years, that's been sort of the bar that has been set for Alzheimer's disease trials. And that's why many of them have failed, is because all of them failed to show a clinical benefit, or they failed to show that the progression of the disease was slowed by the drug or not. However, in this case with Aduhelm, the approval was based on a biological finding, in that those who were on Aduhelm had significantly, reduced amyloid plaques in their brain. And the premise was that this is likely to predict and be indicative of a future clinical benefit. And there's been a lot of controversy around this decision. I won't get into all of the details of it, but there is, this decision quite widely right now. So there's a lot of controversy and a lot of arguments on both sides of whether this was the right or wrong decision. However, this approval for Aduhelm is conditional, and they actually, the drug itself will not be fully approved until it demonstrates a clinical benefit in a follow-up trial. So the actual availability of Aduhelm is still, for it to be widely available, is still, very much down the road. Even though this drug has been approved and, can be ordered and can be administered, there's still a lot of roadblocks to that. So the first one being insurance coverage for Aduhelm, which actually was just recently decided upon, and I'll get into that in a moment. The first one, along with whether the insurance coverage is there or not, is the cost. So when Aduhelm was first approved by the FDA, Biogen, the maker of Aduhelm, projected the per year cost of at $56,000 per patient. So you can see that was a very significant roadblock, and probably would keep a lot of people and keep a lot of insurance companies from covering such a treatment. I know that, but I can say that very recently, Biogen has now decreased that cost by half. And the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, so the federal agency that basically dictates what Medicare does and does not cover, has given this sort of conditional coverage for Aduhelm, where they will only cover it if it's being used in a research or clinical trial setting. And again, they're still not going to cover it in a wider clinical use, but right now just in more research settings until they can be more definitive about its benefit. The other major roadblock that is logistical to Aduhelm is the fact that it's not a pill or a tablet. So it's administered through an IV infusion. So what this means is that somebody who wants to be treated with Aduhelm, has to go to an infusion center and, sit there for a few hours and, have an IV infusion done. So right now, the availability of infusion centers is quite limited because most of the time they're being used for cancer patients and other, diseases that require IV infusion treatments. So there's a huge bottleneck in terms of having the actual logistical capability to have people with Alzheimer's disease, come in and be treated for this. I've put these links here, and I am going to share my slides with everybody. Chase will be able to share these with everyone, but these are links to some news articles about Aduhelm, so you can kind of read some more details about it and see why there has been so much controversy around its decision to be approved. So I'll wrap up with just a few thoughts. So where we're going, where we really see, the treatment and detection of Alzheimer's disease, is that we see a day very soon where regular screening is going to occur once an individual reaches a certain age, not unlike colon cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, things like that. Once you reach a certain age, you get a yearly by yearly screening. What's going to happen very likely is that this initial screening will likely be a blood test. If that blood test is positive, it would then be followed up with amyloid imaging to actually confirm whether or not there is, amyloid plaque already being deposited in the brain. If that person turns out to be amyloid positive, we would then be able to initiate anti-amyloid treatments at that time. And again, this is before someone is showing clinical symptoms. And this would allow us to either significantly delay or, again, completely prevent the onset of those clinical symptoms from occurring. So just to show you that the blood tests are not pie in the sky, these are very much here and going to be available very soon widely. This blood test for the first blood test for amyloid was approved about a year and a half ago by the FDA. So there is a blood test for amyloid available. It's still not being widely used. There's still a lot of recommendations and training that has to be done with clinicians to do this. But we do have a blood test for amyloid that is available, and very soon, very likely, there will also be a blood test for tau, or what make that protein that makes up tangles. So again, just to show you that these blood tests for Alzheimer's disease are very, much on the cusp of being a reality, in clinical settings. So to conclude, what I really want to convey is that the definition of Alzheimer's disease is evolving from one that is clinically defined to one that is biologically defined. And that, we will be in a place to do routine screening for these biological markers, and then we can implement disease-modifying treatments so that our total definition of Alzheimer's disease one day will not include cognitive symptoms. It will be based purely on these biological signs. What this paves the way for is, in the near future, for us to have a first survivor of Alzheimer's disease. So how we kind of think about a survivor of Alzheimer's disease is not that different from a survivor of cancer. So someone has been screened for a certain cancer. They find that they have markers for it. They get a biopsy done. It confirms that there is cancer in, an organ or some part of the body. And that person, goes on a chemotherapy or radiation treatment, and they continue that. They go into remission, and then hopefully they are cured and never comes back. We see the same thing with Alzheimer's disease. We see a day where somebody will be screened. The biological markers will be positive. They will be put on a treatment that, stops that those plaques and tangles from continuing to form. And that person, lives the rest of their life without any cognitive difficulties, and they have then survived Alzheimer's disease. So I also put here some resources for anybody who is interested in learning more. In particular, if you are interested in being a part of the ongoing efforts to do prevention trials in Alzheimer's disease, the Alzheimer's Prevention Registry is a great place to get started. There's also a gene match program where if people are so inclined, they can provide a mouth swab to get a genetic sample. Now, the results of that genetic test are not shared with the person, but what they are used is they're put into a database in which, if they meet the criteria for a new trial that comes up, they can be contacted very easily and say, based on, the gene data we have, you might be a good fit for this trial, and they can have that person go in. And again, the Alzheimer's Association is an excellent resource for information on Alzheimer's disease. And the Banner Alzheimer's Foundation is a great resource in our community that relies solely on philanthropic funds. And they support our caregiver education classes that we do, and also the talks like this one that myself and my colleagues give all around the Valley, and for the last 2 years now virtually, but hopefully one day soon we'll all be back in person and doing this in front of everybody. So here's some other ways that you can stay connected and stay involved, with the Banner Alzheimer's Institute and the Banner Alzheimer's Foundation. And with that, I will conclude the presentation. I will answer any questions that might have come up in the chat.
Thank you, Mike, for the presentation. Yes, we do have some time left over if folks are wanting to submit their questions in the chat room, or maybe unmute their microphones and ask questions personally. We are recording this, so if you can please keep a kind of generic profile. Don't maybe say your loved one's name, maybe just say your loved one. We have about 20 minutes or so if you have any questions, I'm sure Mo can stay on and we'll answer all we can.
Hello, yes. My dad died of Alzheimer's several years ago, and I was his caregiver for a short time. So I'm naturally interested in this, and I believe what I'm taking away from this is if I would like to become a candidate for prevention trials, I would go to endalznow.org. Would that be the starting point?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay.
Yes, I can tell you I work with that team quite a bit, in different areas. They're very responsive, and, they've been responsible for the enrollment of several thousand individuals across the country into prevention trials. So, if your desire is there, they will, they will do their best to find a study for you to be in.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We had a question come in, Mike. Somebody was asking that you shared about significant risk factors for Alzheimer's. Is there any research for environmental factors as well?
Yeah, so there's a little bit. It's come out slowly but surely. So the studies, there are some studies that tend to indicate that there are some environmental factors that may increase the risk for Alzheimer's disease. In particular, air pollution is one that has been studied, to a certain degree. Unfortunately, the strength of the evidence is not there to say that there is a definitive link, but certainly there's a hint that there are some environmental factors, particularly with air pollution, that may be playing a part in the risk of Alzheimer's disease.
Thank you, Mike. Looks like another question just came in. Whatever came out about the study your office did with the Columbia family, that extensive early onset of Alzheimer's.
Great question. Great question. Thank you for that. So I'll give a little background information on this. So I don't include this in the talk because I don't want to throw too much information out there. So when I said that, there's not, so the genetic component to Alzheimer's disease, as we usually understand it, is basically, it increases your risk. However, there are forms of Alzheimer's disease that are tied to specific genetic mutations. And in particular, there are certain, in Colombia, for many years now, there's been a cohort and in a number of individuals around a certain village that have developed Alzheimer's disease and in their late 30s and early 40s and progressed very rapidly. And these individuals have a very specific mutation of what's called the presenilin gene. And so these individuals we began a clinical trial with them in 2012, where we wanted to see if individuals who were at, basically a very imminent risk for getting Alzheimer's disease. So with this genetic mutation, this is not just a risk. This is actually, if you have this certain mutation, you get Alzheimer's disease with a very high degree of certainty. And you get it much younger, and it progresses much faster than what we're typically used to seeing. So in this cohort in Colombia, we've enrolled individuals who are carriers of this mutation, but are not showing any cognitive symptoms. And the trial has been ongoing since 2012. I just heard from our leader, Dr. Terrio, on this, in that we are likely to have our first initial results of efficacy within the next 6 months. So probably by the summertime is when we'll have the initial findings of whether this treatment was effective in this group of individuals. And that's really important because if it's shown to be effective in this group of individuals who are, again, at a very high, almost 100% certainty to get Alzheimer's disease, if their progression is either slowed or stopped, that has huge implications for everybody who suffered from Alzheimer's disease around the world. So that is the best update I have for the trial in Colombia.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. Another question somebody had posted. Is there a method of providing screening tests / samples to a group of people, maybe mobile testing?
Right now, there is not. So as I mentioned, the screening methods that I've shown you and talked about, those are still very much in development, if you will. Now, even though the amyloid blood test has been approved by the FDA, again, there's still some logistical concerns with, how it's implemented in clinical settings, how people are prescribed or not prescribed it, but how they're written orders for it and things like that. So there's still, the administrative and logistical hurdles that have to sort of be overcome before those become mainstream.
Sounds good, Mike. Another question: what kind of early cognitive testing is available in Phoenix, and what is the approximate cost?
So the most of the time when, and usually this is referred to as neuropsychological testing. And usually that's done because, somebody is having a memory complaint or is showing some cognitive symptoms, and they're referred to a neuropsychologist from their primary care doctor or a neurologist. Most of the time, that is covered by Medicare or insurance, but in cases where, where the person is just wanting to, kind of figure out if they might be at risk for something down the road, or to be sort of tracked, if you will, there are observational longitudinal studies here that allow for that. So the first one is the Brain and Body Donation Program at the Banner Sun Health Research Institute in Sun City. I don't have their contact information, but if you go to their website, just if you do Banner Sun Health Research Institute, it'll take you to the website and they'll have the contact information there. There's also a long ongoing study that's been done at Mayo Clinic since the mid-90s, and that's at the Mayo Clinic in Scottsdale. They've enrolled people with various levels of genetic risk for several years now, so that's another possibility. Again, I apologize for not having the contact information for that one, but for any individuals who are interested in sort of getting the tests and kind of having some degree of knowledge before beforehand or right now, those are just some of the options that are available. And in some cases, these are not comprehensive diagnostic tests, but I can say that from my experience working on those kinds of studies is that because you're being followed pretty closely, the physicians and study staff, they do sort of alert people when they start to see something that might be clinically significant.
Thank you, Mike. No more questions have come in through the chat, but we still have a little bit more time left if folks want to unmute themselves, or if you want to continue typing any questions you might have. Mike is happy to take any questions.
I believe I saw Jerry raise his hand, or do the raise hand thing. If Jerry, if you have a question, you're welcome to ask it.
He hasn't unmuted yet. So with the blood test, Mike, I know a lot of came out last summer. Kind of where is the progress of that now, since we're, I think, about a year since the big announcement came out? Has there been any movement? Are we closer to getting it out into the public, or is it still kind of
So there are a limited number of of physicians who can order the test for their patients. Again, the issue here is that in order and my understanding may be a little bit off on this, but is that the physicians who want to be able to order this blood test for amyloid have to go through some kind of a certification process in order to make sure that they are, ordering it for the right people and for the right reasons in that sense. So, so there's a clinician education component that still, has to be done and rolled out. And then of course, making this blood test available to, labs all over the country. So like, with SonoraQuest being able to do it and, Quest Diagnostics being able to do it, those are some of the hurdles that still have to be, cleared before it's going to be widely available.
I got you. So we did have another question. You were talking about type 2 diabetes, and somebody asked, what is it about type 2 diabetes that poses a significant risk for Alzheimer's?
Excellent question. So the link, or the proposed link, between type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's disease has to do with insulin resistance. We know that within type 2 diabetes, your insulin resistance is compromised because of your beta cells in the pancreas that no longer produce insulin. So what has been found, and there's still there's still a lot of work being done on this to really clarify it and understand this better, but there's also insulin resistance in the brain. And as it turns out, insulin is actually a very important neurotransmitter. And what we're seeing is that when we see insulin resistance also occur in the brain, is that sets off or seems to set off a lot of different toxic reactions within the neurons. And it's those toxic reactions that seem to be one of the things that may kick off what initiates amyloid being deposited in the brain. So there's still a lot of animal models and basic research that's being done in that area to really clarify that relationship. But right now, that's what we think is going on in terms of the type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's disease link.
Very informative, Mike. Looks like we've had no other questions come in. Give it a minute or so to see if anybody else has any more questions, if they want to unmute themselves or put it in the chat.
If I may,
yes.
I'm a retired internist, and my father was a patient at Banner's Alzheimer's Institute and passed away in March of 2012. But I just want to say he received excellent care. I've really enjoyed your presentation. And also, as you said, we're most fortunate to have the Institute here because really there is, you guys really do cutting edge research, and all these prevention trials and the various trials are for those in the Valley who are interested in enrolling. These are opportunities that very few other communities are afforded. So thank you very much for all the good work you do.
Oh, you're very welcome, David. And, my condolences to you for the loss of your father to it. I know that I personally, I've had, one or two family members who've dealt with it. And, just kind of anecdotally, I can tell you that the first year that I got into the field was when I graduated with my bachelor's from U of A. And at around the same time, that's when my wife and I started dating. And that's when I met her stepfather's mom. And at the time she had just been diagnosed, but they were really unsure because she was doing really well and could still do a lot, and these kinds of things. And she was a really, really sweet lady, and I got to know her pretty well. And then so 5 years down the road, my wife and I had moved to Florida for me to do graduate school. And when we went on a cruise with her in our family, it was obvious that there was a lot of decline, and it just was really hard because for me personally, I was one of the last people she met, very early on in the disease process. And I was one of the first people she forgot. So, I have a little bit of understanding of what, the pain is for people who have loved ones who are afflicted by it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And thank you for the kind words of our programs.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. We do have clinical trials at all three of our locations. We are located in Phoenix as well as in Sun City, Arizona, and in our new location of Tucson. So we are doing clinical trials at all three of our locations. But looks like no other questions have come through. Mike, thank you for joining us today. A lot of great information you gave us, Mike. So hopefully everybody enjoyed. Please come by one of our programs again. Visit our website at www.banneralz.org/calendar. And you can get an idea of all the programs that we offer on a monthly basis, as well as support groups. Due to the pandemic that's going on, we are still doing everything virtually, so we aren't doing anything in person just yet. We hope to get to that soon. Whoops, maybe we might have had another question come in, Mike. Sorry.
Okay, that's okay.
So somebody asked, I think I understand the issue of memory loss with Alzheimer's, but what causes the combativeness of some patients?
Many times what we see in the clinical course of the disease, sometimes early, but most of the time later on in the progression of the disease, is that we see people with behavioral problems and emotion. They start to either become depressed, or we see people with hallucinations and agitation and things like that. So the combativeness, unfortunately, we don't know the exact cause of it. It unfortunately is part of the progression of the disease with the losing brain cells and losing brain function as a result of the disease. So there's not, as far as I know, and this would probably be a better question for our physicians, particularly Dr. Terrio, who really kind of was a pioneer in this area, is that there's likely some specific neurochemical basis for it, but it has more to do with just the progression of the disease than anything, is my understanding.
Hopefully that answered the question as best as Mike can. But looks like no other questions have come through. Thank you again, Mike, for the wonderful presentation. Looks like everybody really enjoyed it. Please go visit our website if you are interested in attending any of our other programs that we offer, as well as if you're looking to join any support groups. They are free to the public. We aren't charging for any of our educational or support groups, but hopefully everybody has a safe rest of their day, and we hope to see you again sometime soon. Thank you again, everybody. And
Thank you all for the opportunity to talk. I appreciate it.